Good evening, class. I am Ritanik Chum, and my presentation is on unique weapons of the medieval period. All right, let's start off. First, we have the Guten Dag, also known as the Guten Dak or Guten Dard. Um, its weapon was widely used in history, but remained pretty obscure due to its association with the peasant class. While its precise origin is pretty unclear, it gained pretty popularity among the Flemish during the 14th century Franco-Flemish War. So the name derives from the expression Guten Dag, which translates to good day in Dutch. And according to certain accounts following the war, um, Flemish militia patrolled the streets after taking the French garrison and their supporters in Bruges in 1302. They would greet whoever they saw basically with Guten Dag, and anyone possessing a French accent or spoke French was slain during that. And following this, the Flemish took control of this city. So this weapon was pretty easy to make and pretty cheap. Basically, a spear, just less quality, um, less metal used, just basically a spike with a stick attached to it. The next weapon we have is the war scythe. So the war scythe, like the Guten Dark, was mostly used by peasants, mostly for uprisings in situations where they lacked actual arms. Throughout history, it was a common practice to repurpose agricultural tools for the peasants that had to fight for their survival. While the exact origin of the war scythe remains pretty uncertain, it's believed that they were used as far back as ancient Greece, because we have a Greek historian named Xenophon, which famously described the utilization of scythes mounted on wheels of Persian chariots. Uh, a little different than what we have here, but still basically the same thing since we're just repurposing a regular scythe. This was actually pretty popular against Polish and Lithuanian revolutionaries in the 18th and 19th century also. This weapon was pretty easy for craftsmen to make, basically taking the head off of a farming scythe up here in the top right, and then rotating about 90 degrees upwards, which would make it right here. They were used also by the Poland or the Polish people against this Swedish invasion in the 17th century known as the Deluge. They would use a slashing or stabbing motion, as you could see right here, just like a regular pole arm. Then for our next weapon, we have dueling shields. The dueling shields were pretty obscure and one of the most unusual weapons on here. They weren't actually used in actual combat, but more in dueling combat, just like 1v1s, as seen right here. The concept of enhancing swords with offensive elements, such as spikes, have been practiced as long as shields themselves were made. However, using them as primary weapons without any other accompanying weapon is relatively uncommon. So the pretty much one of the only accounts I can get from this was from Hans Stauffer, which was a Swabian fencing master, pretty popular among the German nobles for his judicial duels. So in 1440, Stauffer made a manual depicting the use of shields, as in this picture. Although they are pretty improbable on the battlefield, they were just used in dueling. For our next weapon, we have dead animals slash corpses. So dead animals slash corpses were used in trebuchets or catapults to launch over walls to inflict physiological and biological damage on the defenders. We have three pretty big accounts about this. In 1340, during the attack of the castle of Thun-le-Éveque, which is now northern France, attackers employed catapults to hurl dead horses or other animals to the defenders, overwhelming them by the noxious stench and foul air. Um, the defenders had to negotiate a truce with them. And in 1346, we have the Tartars begin sieging the port of Kaffa on the Black Sea. They encountered an outbreak in the city and had to fling dead bodies over the city walls. And then fleeing residents would actually carry the disease to Italy, contributing to the second major outbreak of the Black Death. And in 1422, we have the Siege of Karlston in Bohemia. The forces attacking resorted launching decomposing corpses of fallen soldiers over the castle. Additionally, they even added animal manure to it to spread illness. But despite the efforts, the defenders held their ground and the siege had to be abandoned 5 months later. Next weapon, we have the handheld Culverian. So the handheld Culverian was mostly used by the Scots and since James the Fourth was an enthusiastic user of them. The regular Calvarian, which is basically a big cannon for siege, is was more used than the handheld Calvarian, which is just a mini cannon basically. These would be used by cavalry known as Culvarians. Basically, instead of using a sword or a bow and arrow, they would use this, or by bowmen, they would just use this too. Um, Not widely popular due to the small barrel and heavy ball. It wasn't as accurate compared to a much more popular weapon called the Falcon, which resembles the typical gun used during that period, which were more deadlier in accuracy against infantrymen. Next, we have boiling oil. So, because boiling oil was so expensive, they were actually used as much compared to boiling water, hot sand, or even boiling sewage. Defenders would use this over the wall to stop attackers from either breaking into the wall, digging under, or using ladders to climb over. Um, it was a pretty good defensive strategy as when later castles were built, they built manholes, murder holes, as seen in the top right over here, where they would just pour oil out of, or maybe even shoot arrows. And so what? We have an account of this during the defense of Yodfat. They used it against the Vespian troops in 47 AD, and also other accounts like the Hundred Years' War, Siege of Orleans in 1428, the Great Siege of Malta in 1565, and even some years in the French Wars of Religion. Next, we have the Hellburners. So the Hellburners is a variant of an older weapon called fire ships, which were first created during the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens. Basically, they would set the ships on fire and send them towards enemy fleet. But this was improved on by a man called Federico Gambel, which was an Italian military engineer. He basically improved it with the shipbuilding and adding gunpowder to the ship to make it much more destructive. So this would be sent into enemy fleets, enemy ports, or even enemy castle walls that were close to the coast. This was first brought up during the 80 Years' War to the Dutch. Basically, Federico Gambelli introduced this idea to the Spanish, but they denied it, so he went to the Dutch, which was their opposing enemy. And then seeking the vengeance against the Spanish, Gambili sought to destroy their ships using this idea. Next, we have the man catcher, which is a pretty obscure weapon compared to the other ones, unless the dueling shield. The man catcher was a pole used in Europe as late as until 18th century, but can get traced all the way back to ancient Rome. This was a way to catch somebody, maybe law enforcement, but also criminals used it to catch noblemen off their horses for ransom since it was non-lethal. It was considered the only non-lethal weapon as its time, the only non-lethal pole arm at the time, and they are still used today um, by the Japanese law enforcement. Last but not least, we have fire arrows. So fire arrows um, were a lot heavier compared to regular arrows. As a result, it had a shorter reach. Additionally, an archer could only shoot fewer arrows at a time. The piercing ability of the fire arrows were also inferior to piercing ability of a regular arrow. Fire arrows could burn for 60 to 90 seconds and had an extra long arrowhead with a small iron cage filled with a mixture of sulfur, saltpeter, and charcoal, which let it burn for that long. The use of fire arrows was basically to set massive fires on the battlefield, but only had about 2% chance of doing so. If the battlefield field had basically no flammable objects. There wasn't much use of using the fire arrow. And that is my presentation. Here's my bibliography. Uh, Thank you.